Welcome, church. We're talking about Ecclesiastes. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, that's better.
The book of Ecclesiastes may be more relevant today and significant today at this point in history than it's ever been. Now, if you're like me, then you hear a preacher say something like that or a speaker say something like that, and you roll your eyes and think, come on, Renee. But let me explain why I think that might actually be true. Philosopher Charles Taylor said there are basically two ways of looking at the world, of looking at reality. Either the first way as something to conform ourselves to, which has historically been the way that people looked at the world. So something that is bigger than us that we are to conform ourselves to, or the other way being something that we can manipulate and conform to ourselves. Something that we are to conform ourselves to, or something that we are to that we are able to conform to ourselves, to manipulate, to make it exactly what we want it to be. And again, for most of human history, it's been the former. That humanity has seen itself and seen the world in reality as something much bigger than himself and something that he should conform himself to, not something that he can simply manipulate or shape to ourselves. But now more than ever, it is the latter view. Now more than ever, we have this viewpoint that the world is basically just raw material that we can shape and make however we would like to shape and make it, that it is malleable and can be conformed to us, that we, in some sense, are bigger than reality or bigger than the world, right? Think about it like this. Agrarian societies or farming societies of the past, throughout history, knew they had to plant a certain type of crop at a certain time and harvest a certain time later based on the environment and all these other things that were beyond them, that were out of their control. They had very little control over the outcomes of the crops. They had very little control over the soil, no control over the weather, no control. And so they were keenly aware that they were underneath something bigger than them, that they were reliant upon something much bigger than them, aware of their inability to make things the way they wanted to make them, and their need to submit to things that were bigger than them, to conform to what the world had offered them. Right? And in having no control over those things and over these crops, there was a real sense in which they had no control even over their very lives, life or death. They were entirely at the mercy of the environment. The world was what it was, and the individual needed to conform to it. Now, with the invention of irrigation, water can be moved or stored until necessary, until needed. Increased knowledge of soil science and pesticides means the land can be manipulated to be what we need the land to be. More controversially, genetic manipulation of plants allows production of food that is immune to parasites. So we can now have control over those things. So as a result of these things and new technologies, the modern man has come to believe that he can basically control the world, right? Think about diseases that used to be untreatable are now virtually gone. Childbirth, which used to be a significant risk to the life of the mother, has become almost no risk at all, or at least very little risk compared to what it used to be for the mother. These are all very good things, right? It's good things that we can do these things. But because of these abilities and because of these things that allow us this new sense of control, it's increasingly easy to think that reality, that the world, that the big things are really something that we can manipulate. Something that in some sense we are above and bigger than, and not something that we simply need to conform ourselves to. In one of the best books that I have ever read, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, a book that explains our current culture better than any that I've read. Trueman says we can see this clearly with one statement in particular that is incredibly modern. This statement: I am a woman trapped in a man's body. Think about that statement. I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. This statement, which has at least become a statement that everyone has heard, or at least heard discussed, is a result of this newfound desire to manipulate reality instead of conform to it. If someone would have said to a doctor a century ago, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, the doctor would have said, that's a problem. with your feelings, right, and with your mind. We need to bring those things in conformance to your body. If someone was to say it to a doctor now, the doctor would say, that's a problem. It's a problem with your body. We need to bring your body in conformance with your feelings and with your mind, right? So point being, there has been a significant change in our current culture to this end of thinking that the things that we used to think were above us and beyond us, like our bodies and like reality and like the world, are really things that we should lower below our feelings and what we think about certain things, right? The most important things in the modern culture is our feelings, and conforming everything outside, everything that used to be seen as beyond us, to what I feel inside, when historically it has been the opposite. Throughout history, our sense of self has been defined largely by outside things and by others, and now it's defined almost entirely by our feelings and our inner psychology. This, of course, has overflown into the church as well, so that church is no longer something bigger than us and beyond us, something that we are to conform ourselves to, something we're meant to be a small part of. Rather, it has become the servant of the individual, the servant of our psychology and our inner feelings. We judge worship and sermons as if they're TV shows meant to entertain us, focusing still on our feelings and picking churches that conform to us. Truman says, in short, church went from a place to be formed to a place to perform. And many church leaders have followed suit and have conformed church to the individual instead of calling individuals to conform to the thing that is above them. The prevailing ideology of our culture is not that you should discover truth with a big T, like it has been for the most of mankind's history. The current prevailing ideology of our culture is that you should discover your truth, little t, right? It's not that you should discover big truth, big T, objective, huge, above us, unchangeable truth, and that you should conform yourself to that truth. Rather, it is you should find your truth, and you can conform your truth to yourself however you like. The message of Ecclesiastes, as we have seen, is that life is hevel, meaning largely that life is uncontrollable. It is not malleable. It is not able to be shaped, that it's something beyond us, above us, that the rivers keep flowing, the sun keeps rising. No matter what we do during our lives, things are beyond us. It is not able to be conformed to us, but rather it is something that we should conform ourselves to. Something that we should enjoy as the gift of the God that is beyond us and above us and transcends us. Further, God is not a God, more specifically. God is not a God that we can mold and shape and conform to how we would like him to be, but a God that we must conform ourselves to, right? That is against our culture. You can see that clearly. That the idea of a God that is above us and beyond us, that we must conform ourselves to that God, is much less attractive than a God who we can conform to be shaped like us, to like the things we like, to agree with the things we agree with, disagree with the things we disagree with. It is offensive to say that you must conform yourself to something bigger than yourself. That there is no such thing really as your truth, but only the truth. Here, we as Christians must not give in to the way that culture views things. We must stand for and yield to big T, big R, big U, big T, big H, big truth. The message is that truth is found in God, and that the only life worth living is the one with God at the center, and the one that enjoys God and that is centered on that truth. And that all things that are not grounded in God are grounded in nothing and no more than vapor. All things, all little t truths, everything that is not grounded in God is grounded in nothing and is no more than vapor. Perhaps Kohelet's strongest example and underlying foundation for the hevel of all things disconnected from God is death. Death proclaims our impotence. That is, our incredible lack of power, our lack of ability to control things. If you got your Bibles, we're going to look at a few verses in Ecclesiastes. Open first to chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. I'm not going to have them on the screen for those of you who are watching. You can listen or you can follow along with me. Ecclesiastes 2, 15 to 17. It says, "Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also," referencing death. "Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten, how the wise dies just like the fool." Chapter 3, verse 18. "I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return." Chapter 9, verse 1. "All this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath." Referencing that everything ends in death, whether I lived well or lived poorly. Not meaning that it is meaningless to live well or live poorly, but meaning that it is totally and utterly out of our control. That death proclaims loudly that there is something bigger than us, that there's something beyond us, something that transcends us. It proclaims loudly our smallness, right? Death is an ultimate reality. Death is an unavoidable, real, and true thing, which in the end renders every striving life futile. Human or animal, wise or fool, rich or poor, success or failure, all end in death because we cannot control the things that are real, the things that are truest, the things that are beyond us. We like to think of ourselves as gods, really, that have control over things in the world. But in the end, we end up no different than animals, at least under the sun. All we have to do is live long enough, and we'll be bereaved. We will lose somebody that we love. We'll lose a lot of those if we live long enough. Eventually, all of us individually will die ourselves. Yet, despite the commonality of this thing, despite the imminence of this event for all of us, D.A. Carson points out that death has become basically the last taboo subject in our culture, the last thing we really can't talk about, right? We can talk casually about sex, fornication, bigotry, many other obscenities. But if you bring up death of someone you love, the air gets thicker, things get heavier, people shut down, not knowing what to say, because death is avoided at all costs by the world. We don't want to think about that reality that we just can't control. This is one area that mankind has made no progress in, right? We've done better with diseases, and we've done better with farming, and we've done better with technology, but we just keep dying. Psalm chapter 90, verse 10 says, "The years of our life are 70, or if even by reason of strength, 80. That was written 3,000 years ago. How much have we gained since then? The years of our life are 70, and if by reason of strength, 80. What have we gained? 5, 10 years, maybe, in 3,000 years? We just can't seem to make progress against death. We're controlling farming, we're controlling travel, we're controlling all these things that we used to couldn't control, but we just can't get our hands around death and make it be what we want it to be. 100% of us still die. Death mocks us, knowing in the end it will win, and all of our strivings will come to nothing. Christians throughout history have thought it good for people to be aware of death and that we will die. That it reminds us of the realest things, of the truest things, and not the trivial ones that occupy our minds constantly. I've said before, one of the great unexpected blessings of being a minister is that I have to go to a lot of funerals. And every time I leave, I think, man, I wish everyone had to go to these at least once a month. To be reminded of how trivial the things that we worry about really are in comparison to the realest things, the truest things, the things that are bigger and above us. During World War II, I've mentioned before, one of my favorite speeches of all time, sermons of all time, C.S. Lewis was invited to speak to students at Oxford who were having a very hard time understanding why they should continue studying and doing school while World War II was going on everywhere around them. How meaningless it all seemed. The whole sermon you can find anywhere. It's called Learning in Wartime. It's beautiful. But a small section of it is relevant to us today. He says this: at first, studying seems to be an odd thing to do during a great war. What is the use of beginning a task which we have so little hope of finishing? Or even if we ourselves should happen not to be interrupted by death or military service, why should we, indeed, how can we, continue to take interest in these placid occupations when the lives of our friends and the liberties of Europe are in the balance? Is it not like fiddling while Rome burns? Now, it seems to me that we should not be able to answer these questions until we've put them beside certain other questions which every Christian ought to have asked himself during peacetime. Every Christian who comes to a university must at all times face the question, compared with which the questions raised by the war are relatively unimportant. He must ask himself how it is right, or even psychologically possible, for creatures who are at every moment advancing either to heaven or to hell to spend any fraction of the time allotted to them in this world on such comparative trivialities as literature, or art, mathematics, or biology. If human culture can stand up to that, it can stand up to anything. He says, the war creates no absolute new situation. It simply aggravates the current human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. Human culture has always had to exist under a shadow of something infinitely more important than itself. We think of the streets of Warsaw and contrast the deaths there suffered with an abstraction called life, but there's no question of death or life for any of us. Only a question of this death or of that one, of a machine gun bullet now or a cancer 40 years later. What does war do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us die, and the percentage cannot be increased. It puts several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that that is what we fear. Certainly when the moment comes, it will make little difference how many years we have behind us. Does it increase our chance of a painful death? I doubt it. As far as I can find out, what we call natural death is usually preceded by suffering, and the battlefield is one of the few places where one has a reasonable prospect of dying with no pain at all. Yet war does do something to death. It forces us to remember it. The only reason why the cancer at 60 or the paralysis at 75 do not bother us is that we forget them. War makes death real to us. And that would have been regarded as one of its blessings by most of the great Christians of the past. They thought it good for us to always be aware of our mortality. I am inclined to think that they were right. Your day-to-day life sometimes lures you into the mirage of control over things, lures you into thinking that you have control over the bigger things. Death reminds you unavoidably of your impotence. And then secondly and finally, death proclaims God's omnipotence. So proclaims our impotence, but proclaims God's omnipotence. Verses we just looked at. This is chapter 3. What happens to the children of man and to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. All are from dust, and to dust they return. There is but one being who does not fit in that category. There is but one being who does not apply to this logic. There is but one being who is not a man and not a beast, who will not die. There is but one being who is not from dust. Or chapter 9, the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God, the same event happens to them all. Everything is in the hand of God, the one who does not die, the only being in the universe that does not die. Chapter 8, verse 8, no man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is only one that was not born and does not die. Only one that is above death, reigning over them all. Job chapter 12, verse 10 says, in his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. Chapter 34, if he, that's God, should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish and return to dust. Psalm 104, when you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. Acts 17, God is not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. This is both a comfort to the child of God who is yielding to him and a warning to those who ignore reality and the things that are beyond them and bigger than them and continue to try to manipulate the times to their own advantage. The message is, you are not in control. That's a terrifying message to the one who desires control. The biblical message is, you are not in control. That's terrifying to the one who desires control, but a relief to those of us who trust the one who is in control. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11 and 12. Verses I think we're going to look at some more next week, which will be our final lesson in Ecclesiastes, I believe. It says, again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. Life is unpredictable. And that's terrifying. We are like the fish who is swimming along looking for food like he does every day, and then out of nowhere gets caught in, the word is literally evil, in an evil net, gets caught in evil. We are like the bird who is flying along with great plans for the day, working on building his house, and then out of nowhere gets snared. Anyone who has lived any period of time knows this illustration. That you're going along one day with just your daily concerns, and then out of nowhere, you get a phone call. Out of nowhere, things go awry. And we become ensnared with suffering and evil and pain and the sin that is covering the world. Evil things, bad at times, painful things could be awaiting us outside of those doors today. Life's unpredictable. And that's terrifying. Unless there is one in control. Unless there is one who predicts everything correctly. Unless that one who's in control loves you more than anything else ever has. Death proclaims to us that we are not in control, but it moves our eyes upward to the one who is in control, even here in this arena, even in the arena of death. And of course, God declared that once and for all 2,000 years ago when Christ rose from the grave, conquering death and allowing us to conquer it as well. Inviting us to follow him in the conquering path over death. So that for the Christian, death is no more than just falling asleep. For the Christian, death is no more than a mirage. As real as it is, as true as it is, as bigger than us as it is, as uncontrollable as it is, God is in control of it. And therefore, we can find relief even in the category of death. And death is, again, one of those things that should lift our eyes to the controller, to the omnipotent God, the defeater of the thing that we could not defeat, the one bigger even than the big thing that is death. Love you, church. Talk to you soon.